questions, all of them financial, and received 3 clean answers. She signed the authorization and moved on to the next item on her agenda. Nobody in that room asked who was actually running the system every day. Nobody thought to ask. Logan was eating a sandwich in the server room when HR found him. It was a Wednesday, just past noon. Grace's school had a half day, and he had picked her up at 11:30 and brought her in with him rather than arrange last-minute childcare, which he did occasionally when schedules shifted unexpectedly. Grace was sitting on his jacket on the floor with Biscuit, drawing in a small notebook, completely absorbed. The server room was cool and hummed steadily, and she had been here enough times to know not to touch anything and to speak quietly, which she did, narrating a story she was telling Biscuit under her breath. The HR representative was a young woman named Sandra, who had clearly been asked to do something she found uncomfortable and was trying to get it done efficiently. She handed Logan a white envelope. She said the words the way people say words they have rehearsed. Position eliminated, restructuring, effective end of week, 3-month severance, return of access credentials. Logan put the sandwich down. He took the envelope and turned it over once in his hands. "Who's going to handle the phase drift condition on Node 7? He asked. Sandra looked at him, the way people look at someone who has said something in a language they almost recognize. "I'm sorry? Node 7. There's a thermal behavior that occurs under specific load conditions in high summer. It requires a particular response sequence, or it cascades. Has anyone briefed the incoming team on that?" Sandra's expression indicated that she had not been briefed on Node 7 or phase drift or thermal behavior, and that she was not sure what any of it meant, and that she was very much hoping this conversation would end soon. "The incoming team has been given full access to the system documentation," she said carefully. Logan nodded once. He put the envelope in his jacket pocket. He turned back to the terminal and completed the task he had been running when she walked in a minor routing anomaly he had caught that morning. The kind of thing that wouldn't cause a problem today but would eventually, if left unaddressed. He ran the correction, verified the result, saved the log, and then stood up. "Thank you, Sandra," he said. He folded his jacket over his arm. He picked up Grace's notebook and her crayon tin and handed them to her, and Grace gathered Biscuit and stood up, and they walked out together. As they crossed the main floor toward the elevator, they passed the conference room where the glass walls showed the 3 men in suits being walked through the space by Dominic. There was a small gathering of curious employees watching the introduction. Someone was clapping. Carter was the one who saw Logan first. He was mid-sentence when his eyes moved past Dominic's shoulder and landed on the man with the cardboard box and the small girl. Something crossed Carter's face recognition, and then something more complicated than recognition. He half raised one hand. Dominic stepped to the side, angling Carter's attention back toward the room, and the moment passed. Evelyn was standing at the top of the wide staircase that overlooked the floor. She was looking at the conference room, satisfied with how the introduction was going, when she noticed the man with the box walking toward the lobby. A child was beside him. The child was holding a rabbit. The man moved without hurry, which struck Evelyn briefly as unusual for someone carrying out their belongings, and then she looked away and turned back to the conversation she had been having. In the lobby, the security guard at the front desk was a man named Marcus, who had worked the morning shift for 5 years and knew every regular employee by name and most of them by coffee order. He came around the desk when he saw Logan. "Mr. Logan," he said, and held the door. "Thank you, Marcus," Logan said. "Of course." Marcus held the door until they were through. He didn't ask any questions. He had learned, over 5 years, to read a situation. Outside, Grace tugged Logan's hand and looked up at him. The afternoon was bright and warm. "Daddy, those men inside, the ones in the nice jackets. What about them? Did you know them?" Logan looked down the block. "Yes." "How?" "I taught them things." Grace considered this. "So they're your students?" "They were." "Are they smarter than you now?" Logan thought about that for a moment. Not about whether it was true, but about how to answer a 6-year-old honestly without being either cruel or dishonest. "They know a lot," he said. "They're very good." Grace accepted this. She swung his hand once. "Can we get ice cream?" "Yes," he said. "We can get ice cream." He did not look back at the building. That evening, after Grace was asleep with Biscuit tucked under her chin, Logan sat at the kitchen table with his personal laptop open. He was not browsing job listings. He had already received 2 messages from former colleagues at other firms before he had even gotten home. The professional network that surrounds anyone with real expertise tends to move quickly when word circulates that someone is available. He would look at those messages tomorrow. Tonight he was working on something else. He had been building a document for the past several months, a comprehensive operational guide for NextCore Grid, written the way he would write a guide for someone who had to keep the system alive alone at 3 in the morning with no one to call. Not a high-level architecture document, not a glossy internal wiki entry, a real document, step-by-step failure responses, edge case behaviors cataloged by the conditions that triggered them, manual override sequences for every known anomaly. And at the center of it, a detailed entry on ThermalSync, the module he had built and never fully documented in any official system, the subsystem that managed the thermal behavior of Node 7 under summer load conditions. He worked for 2 hours. He wrote carefully. At a certain point he added a note in the ThermalSync section, Phase Drift, Node 7. Activation conditions. Ambient temperature, combined with simultaneous load exceeding 94% of peak capacity. Occurs July through August. ThermalSync state memory must not be reset during remediation. Reinitialization sequence required if state is lost. He wrote out the reinitialization sequence in full. He saved the document to his personal drive. He did not send it to anyone at Nexora. He sat there for a moment looking at the screen. Then he closed the laptop, turned off the kitchen light, and went to bed. Carter, Adrian, and Isaac had their kickoff meeting with Evelyn and Dominic on the following Monday. They presented a roadmap that was, objectively, impressive. An 18-month phased plan to modernize the infrastructure layer, reduce cloud spend by an estimated 17%, and expand the system's capacity to onboard new enterprise clients. The slide deck was polished. The Q&A was fluent. Evelyn sat through it with her arms folded and her expression attentive, asking pointed questions that the 3 of them answered well. After the meeting, walking back to the technical operations floor, Carter pulled up the original NextCore Grid architecture files in the shared repository. He was thorough enough to want to understand the foundation before he started building on it. He opened the folder, skimmed the top-level file dense, unusually written, organized around principles rather than standards, with hand-annotated diagrams that did not follow any convention he had been trained on, and then closed it. "Old-school style," he said to Adrian. "We'll need to refactor the documentation before we can build on it properly." Adrian nodded. They moved on. The first 2 weeks were smooth. Carter identified 3 redundant processes in the monitoring layer and eliminated them. Adrian optimized a database indexing routine that had been running inefficiently. Isaac tightened up the traffic routing logic on 4 secondary nodes. Evelyn received weekly progress summaries that reflected real, measurable improvements. Dominic reviewed them with visible satisfaction. What none of them knew, what no one on the current team knew, was that by eliminating one of those redundant processes, Carter had removed the secondary check that ThermalSync used to validate its state memory before engaging the thermal compensation protocol. The process had not looked redundant from the outside. From the outside, it had looked like a duplicate logging function. Removing it was a reasonable call given everything Carter knew. The problem was that Carter did not know about ThermalSync. And ThermalSync was the thing that kept Node 7 from drifting under summer heat load conditions. And it was the first week of August. The night it happened was a Wednesday, which was the same day of the week Logan had been handed his termination letter, though no one who noticed this coincidence was in a position to find it significant. The temperature outside had reached 96 degrees by 4 in the afternoon, and had not fallen below 88 by midnight. It was the 4th consecutive day of a heat event that the weather services were calling historic. Inside the Nexora server facility, the climate control systems were working at capacity, and the ambient temperature in the Node 7 quadrant had been reading at 93.2 degrees since 10 p.m. Not yet at the threshold, but close. The system began showing irregular behavior at 11:47 in the evening. Small latency spikes on the Node 7 routing table. The automated monitoring flagged them as moderate priority alerts. At 11:52, the latency spikes became cascading errors as ThermalSync, no longer able to validate its state memory through the process Carter had removed, began cycling in an error loop. By midnight and 3 minutes, the primary routing layer of NextCore grid went offline. 47 enterprise clients lost connectivity simultaneously. Evelyn received the call from Dominic at 12:05. She was in her home office, still working, which was not unusual for her. Dominic's voice was controlled, but she had learned to read the specific quality of his control, and this was the quality that meant something had gone badly wrong. "How long?" she asked. "We don't know yet. Get Carter's team in." Now, the three of them were in the building by 12:15, phones still warm from the calls that had woken them. The server room was lit the way it was lit, at any hour the same flat, steady light, but the screens were full of error states, and the atmosphere was different in a way that experienced technical people recognize immediately. The atmosphere of a system that has stopped cooperating. Carter made his first diagnosis at 12:22. Load balancer failure on Node 7. The fix was a restart. They restarted Node 7. The system did not come back. Adrian took the next pass. Database replication error. The restart had introduced a state mismatch between nodes. He recommended rolling back to a snapshot from 6 hours earlier. The rollback took 22 minutes. The system came back online at 12:57. It ran for 4 minutes and 17 seconds, and then collapsed again, harder than before, cascading across 3 additional nodes. Isaac took the third attempt. The routing tables, he determined, were corrupted not from the original failure, but from the botched rollback, which had written partial state data across the network. He began a manual rebuild of the routing table. The rebuild took 47 minutes. The system came back at 2:13 in the morning. It ran for 9 minutes. Then it failed completely. Every primary node in NextCore grid went dark. The backup failover systems, designed for brief outages, were not architected for this class of cascading failure. They held for 6 minutes, and then they too went quiet. Evelyn stood in the corner of the server room in the clothes she had been wearing when she got the call slacks, a dark blouse, shoes she had not bothered to change. She had a cup of coffee that had been hot when Marcus at the front desk had handed it to her an hour ago and was now entirely cold. She watched Carter sit in front of a terminal with his hands still above the keyboard and not moving. She watched Adrian go through the same sequence of screens for the 5th time. She watched Isaac stare at the routing rebuild log with an expression that she had not seen on a confident person's face before and did not have a name for yet, but which she understood to mean that he had reached the boundary of what he knew and could not see the other side. She looked at Dominic. Dominic was standing near the door with his arms crossed. He was not looking at the screens. He was looking at the floor. His face had a gray quality to it that had nothing to do with the lighting. "Find a solution," she said. "Right now." Carter was still sitting alone in front of the terminal at 2:17 in the morning. The others had stepped out into the corridor, Adrian to make calls, Isaac to review documentation on his laptop. Carter was doing neither of those things. He was sitting in front of the screen, looking at it the way a person looks at a problem that has stopped being a technical problem and become something else. He was thinking about the architecture document he had closed after 2 minutes 3 weeks ago. He was thinking about the hand-annotated diagrams that didn't follow any standard convention. He was thinking about a training session he had attended 4 years ago in a small conference room on the 8th floor when he was 25 years old and had just joined Nexera as a junior engineer, and a man in a plain gray jacket had drawn a diagram on a whiteboard and explained the concept of thermal state drift in distributed systems and why any serious infrastructure architecture needed to account for it from the ground up. He opened his phone. He scrolled to a contact he had not called in 2 years. The phone rang 3 times. "You already know," Carter said, when the line opened. It was not quite a question. "I left a condition in Node 7 when I handed things over," Logan said. His voice was even, unhurried. "It wasn't intentional. I was going to come back and address it. I'm sorry I didn't." Carter said nothing for a moment. In the server room, a monitoring display cycled through a sequence of red indicators, found nothing to encourage, and cycled again. "Can you help?" Carter asked. "I need to speak with your CEO." Carter stood up. He put the phone against his chest and walked to the door and found Evelyn in the corridor. "There's someone on the phone," he said. "You need to talk to him." Logan arrived at 2:38 in the morning, wearing a gray t-shirt and dark pants, carrying nothing. He had left Grace with the neighbor one floor up, a retired schoolteacher named Dorothy, who had a standing arrangement with Logan for exactly these occasions, and who had told him, when he knocked on her door at 2:15, only to go and not worry, which he had tried to do. The taxi had taken 11 minutes. When he came through the front entrance, Marcus was at the desk. Marcus worked the midnight shift 2 days a week, and had apparently drawn the short straw this particular Wednesday. "Mr. Logan," Marcus said, and buzzed him through without a word beyond that. Evelyn was waiting in the corridor outside the server room. She had set the cold coffee down somewhere, and her arms were at her sides. She looked at Logan the way she looked at every new variable in a situation, directly, without expression, trying to determine what category of thing it was. "You're the maintenance technician," she said. "I was," Logan said. "Carter said, you designed the system." "Yes." She looked at him for a moment. There was a quality in her face that was not quite apology and not quite accusation, and was, perhaps, the particular expression of a person who has realized that the map they were given was missing a significant portion of the territory. "He said you trained them, all 3 of them." Logan did not answer that. He looked past her at the server room door. "We can talk after the system is running. Is 4 hours enough to avoid the SLA penalty thresholds on the primary contracts?" Evelyn blinked once. "The threshold is 5.5 hours from initial failure. We're at 2 hours and 35 minutes. "Then we have time," Logan said, "but not a lot of it." He pushed the door open and walked in. Carter and Adrian and Isaac were all in the room. They turned when he entered. Nobody said anything for a moment. Logan looked at each of them in turn, with an expression that was not anger and not satisfaction, and was not performing any particular emotion, because he was already thinking about the problem. He sat down at the central terminal. He pulled the keyboard toward him. "Here's what happened," he said. He was not speaking to Evelyn or to Dominic, who had positioned himself near the rear wall of the room. He was speaking to Carter and Adrian and Isaac, because they were the ones who needed to understand it if they were going to maintain this system after tonight. Next Core Grid has a thermal management subsystem I wrote called Thermal Sync. It manages the phase behavior of Node 7 under high ambient temperature and high simultaneous load. When those 2 conditions meet a specific threshold at the same time, temperature above 92 degrees combined with load above 94% of peak capacity, the system enters a compensatory state that prevents a cascade failure. He typed a sequence of commands, and the terminal displayed a directory structure that none of the 3 of them had seen before. The folder was nested 4 levels deep below the standard architecture directories, named with a string of characters that had no obvious meaning. "Thermal Sync maintains a state memory," Logan continued. "That memory tells it where the system is in the compensation cycle. If the state memory is reset, for example, during a node restart, Thermal Sync loses its position and cycles into an error loop instead of a recovery loop. That's what caused the initial cascade." He paused. "The secondary check that prevented the state memory from being reset was removed 3 weeks ago. It looked like a redundant logging process from the outside. It wasn't. The silence in the room had a specific texture. Adrian had his eyes closed. Isaac was looking at the floor. "I'm not saying that to assign blame," Logan said, and he meant it. His voice carried no edge. "The documentation on Thermal Sync was incomplete. That's my responsibility. I should have finalized it before I left." He turned back to the terminal. The rollback made it worse, because the snapshot didn't capture Thermal Sync's state. So, when the system came back, Thermal Sync was in a cold start condition in the middle of an active thermal event. The routing rebuild on top of that introduced a second layer of partial state data. Right now, the system thinks it's in 3 different operational modes simultaneously, which is why nothing is connecting. He began typing. "The only way to recover from this is a manual reinitialization of Thermal Sync in the correct sequence, followed by a staged node restart that respects the thermal compensation timing. The sequence has to match the specific thermal state of the hardware right now. It's not a fixed procedure. You have to read the current conditions and adjust the timing intervals accordingly." He worked in silence for a few minutes. Carter stood behind him and watched the command sequence on the screen with the focused attention of someone who is learning something he knows he will need to know again. The commands were not ones he recognized from any documentation or training. They were specific to thermal sync, specific to the architecture of NextCore grid, specific to the mind that had built it. The intervals between Stage 3 and Stage 4 need to be extended right now because the ambient temperature is still above 90 degrees, Logan said, adjusting a parameter. If we rush it at this temperature, the state reassertion won't hold. We wait 6 minutes between those two stages. At 3:17, Node 7 came back online and held. At 3:29, the primary routing layer reconnected. At 3:44, NextCore grid was fully operational. All 47 enterprise clients restored. The room was quiet in the specific way that a room is quiet after a long, difficult thing has ended. Carter leaned against the rack beside the terminal. Adrian let out a breath. Isaac sat down on a chair near the wall and put his head back. Logan ran a final verification sequence, not because he was unsure the system was stable, but because he was constitutionally unable to walk away from a critical system without confirming its status with his own eyes. The verification came back clean. He saved the session log and pushed the keyboard back. Evelyn had not moved from her position near the door since she had come into the room to watch. She had watched the entire reinitialization without speaking, without asking questions, without looking at her phone. She had simply watched. Dominic had left the room at some point during the process. Logan had noted his absence and registered it without reaction. "Where's the documentation you mentioned?" Evelyn asked. Her voice was careful. "The thermal sync documentation. It doesn't exist in the Nexora system," Logan said. "I was building a comprehensive guide on my personal drive. I hadn't finished it. Can you share it?" "I'll finish it first." Evelyn looked at him. She had the particular expression of someone who has learned that the model they were using to understand a situation was wrong, and who is now recalibrating. It was not a comfortable expression, but it was an honest one, and Logan found it more trustworthy than comfort would have been. Carter and Adrian excused themselves to get coffee. Isaac followed. When the door closed, the server room was very quiet, just the constant, measured hum of the equipment, the sound that Logan had listened to at the beginning of every working day for 3 years, as a form of orientation, a confirmation that everything was where it was supposed to be. Evelyn sat in the chair Adrian had vacated. She looked at Logan the way she looked at financial models when she was working through them seriously, without performance, without preamble. "I want to understand something," she said. "When HR delivered your termination notice, why didn't you say anything about your history with the system? About thermal sync? About any of it?" Logan considered how to answer this. He settled on the truth, which was also the simplest version. "Because you had already made the decision based on a document that described me as a maintenance technician. I didn't think there was anything I could tell you in that moment that would change how you read the situation. You would have needed context that would have taken more time than a hallway conversation. You could have requested a meeting." "I could have," he agreed. "I asked the HR representative who would handle the Node 7 condition when I was gone. She didn't know what I was referring to. That told me what I needed to know about whether the information would land." Evelyn looked at the terminal screen, still showing the clean verification results. "You left documentation behind that covered this scenario." "Partially. It was incomplete." He paused. "I did flag the issue verbally, to the extent I could in that moment. It wasn't enough. That's also on me." There was a silence that was not awkward. It was the silence of two people looking at an honest accounting without flinching from what it showed. "Dominic presented the restructuring proposal to me," Evelyn said. "He didn't disclose your role in building the system or in training the incoming team." "No," Logan said. "He wouldn't have." She looked at him. "Why not?" Logan was quiet for a moment. Then, "There's a directory in the storage infrastructure. I can give you the path. I'd recommend reviewing it before you have any further conversations with Dominic about how the proposal came together." He wrote the path on a piece of paper from a notepad on the desk and set it in front of her. Evelyn looked at it. She took out her phone, opened the internal file system, and navigated to the path. She read for approximately 4 minutes without speaking. Her face did not change expression, but the quality of her stillness changed. It became the stillness of someone who has just recalculated a large number and found that the total is very different from what they had been told. She set the phone face down on the desk. "How long have you known about that?" she asked. "A while," Logan said. "And you never. It wasn't my place to go looking for it. I came across it in the course of routine work. I noted it. I didn't go further." He looked at the humming rack beside him. "I also didn't feel that going to Dominic's boss with something like that was a safe calculation, given that I had no standing and no clear evidence of anything beyond the existence of a directory." Evelyn absorbed this, the way she did it carefully, without visible reaction, processing it internally before she was ready to speak, told Logan something about her that the past hour had been showing him incrementally. She was not a person who responded to information with the emotion she had not yet finished sorting. She was thorough. She had been given a bad map, but the way she was holding this new information suggested she was a good navigator. "I want to make you an offer," she said. "I should have been making this offer 9 days ago if I had understood what I was looking at. I want you to come back to Nexora, not in the role you were in. I want you to take the role that actually matches what you do here. Chief Infrastructure Officer. You would oversee all system architecture and operations, report directly to me, have the headcount and resources to build the documentation and team structure that should have existed 3 years ago." Logan did not answer immediately. He looked at the screen. He looked at the paper with the file path that he had written and handed to her. He thought about Grace asleep in the apartment 1 floor below Dorothy's, with biscuit under her chin and the drawing pinned to the refrigerator, and the shoes that needed a new pair by fall. "I need to take Grace to school in the morning," he said. Evelyn blinked. "Give me 1 day," he said. "I'll give you an answer by end of business tomorrow." He stood up, picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. He looked at the terminal one final time, not because there was anything left to check, but the way a person looks at something they know well, after a long and difficult night, before they finally leave it. The door opened, and Carter came back in, carrying 2 cups of coffee. He stopped when he saw Logan putting on his jacket. He held out one of the cups. Logan took it and drank from it standing up. "You should reread the architecture notes on E9, Logan said. "Not because anything's wrong with it, because the way I solved the load distribution problem in that module is the cleanest thing I ever designed here. You should understand why it works the way it does." Carter held his own coffee cup with both hands. Something moved across his face, complicated, layered, not fully resolved. He nodded. Logan set the cup down. He shook Carter's hand once, briefly, without making anything of it. He nodded at Evelyn. He walked out through the server room door. It was 6:12 in the morning. The sky outside the building was beginning to lighten, not bright yet, but the particular deep blue that comes just before the city decides to be a day city again, instead of a night one. Marcus was still at the front desk, nearly at the end of his shift. He came around when he saw Logan cross the lobby. "Mr. Logan," he said, and held the door. "Good morning, Marcus," Logan said. "Thank you. Long night?" Logan considered this. "Productive," he said. Outside, the air was still warm from the day before the heat had not released yet, but there was the faintest suggestion that it would eventually. Logan stood on the sidewalk for a moment, looking at nothing in particular. He took out his phone and typed a message to Dorothy. "Home in 20 minutes. Thank you." He added a second message. "Tell Grace I'll make the good pancakes." He put his phone away and raised his hand for a cab. He did not know yet what he was going to tell Evelyn. He did not know if going back was the right answer. The organization that had let him go 9 days ago had done so because of a failure of information, and that failure had lived at multiple levels, in multiple people, and correcting it involved more than restoring one position on an org chart. He understood that. He was not certain that understanding it was enough to make the answer yes. What he did know was that Grace would be awake in 40 minutes, and that she would want to know if this was a pancake morning or a cereal morning, and that he had just promised her the good pancakes, and that a promise made to a 6-year-old with her mother's eyes and her father's stubbornness was not the kind of promise you reconsidered on the basis of complicated organizational considerations. He knew that whatever he decided, he would decide it clearly, honestly, and after he had slept, and he knew that when he had sat down at that terminal in the early hours of the morning and brought the system back from the edge of a catastrophic failure, the system he had built, using knowledge that lived nowhere in any document, that existed only in the mind of the man everyone had agreed, was a maintenance technician. He had not done it for Nexora. He had not done it for Evelyn. He had not done it to prove anything to